Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. The ways that we often leak energy and happiness and well-being is fear of the future. So as humans, one of the things that the realities of the modern world tend to create for us, I believe it's environmental, and there's, lots of neuroscientists and people who've studied this much more than my layperson understanding. But what is true for me and what I've gleaned from the world is our modern era gives us a tremendous number of gifts. Their levels of safety and well-being and access to healthcare and cool things that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. I had a friend who had a heart attack, and what would have been open heart surgery went in through the femoral artery and was one night in the hospital, and home he went all fixed up. Like, there's remarkable cool stuff. Love living in the modern era. And there's an interface that ideally we need to create, knowing that our hunter-gatherer designed biology creates complexity given the responses that we tend to have to the environment. So I think there's a good possibility that despite all of this safety and secure access to food, we may be more stressed and anxious than our hunter-gatherer ancestors who, genuinely dealt with insecure access to food and lack of modern medicine, and willow bark is about the best painkiller you were going to get going if you had that in your area. So it's an interesting kind of way of understanding the world. Like, at the level of fact, things can be so much better, but because of how we're wired, we can end up having a lot more distress and pain than our ancestors necessarily would have experienced. And so if you want to go down the rabbit hole of being, even geekier about this, I'll point you to something I really enjoyed. It's a book called The Joy of Movement: How Exercise Helps Us Find Happiness, Hope, Connection, and Courage. And as someone who at the time that I read that was really wrestling with being a reluctant exerciser, I'm a slightly less reluctant exerciser now. I'm being much more successful in the moving my body effectively in the ways and at the intervals that are most optimal. But for most of my life, reluctant exerciser and lack of exercise was a serious challenge. Ergo, I was always looking for data and science and information and inspiration to help work with this problem in a way that wasn't just constantly being at war with myself, trying to make myself do a thing that, I was reluctant to do. And for those of you who share the reluctant exerciser experience, I think it's worth noting that we do have biologically wired into us aversion circuitry for moving our bodies when we aren't otherwise motivated, and something that's advantageous for survival. So like, I could hunt the thing and there's opportunity and I could get dinner, suddenly we're completely engaged. I might feel like something was a ton of work, but then I'm in a sacred, amazing place in Iceland and there's a huge hill and I'm like, I could totally climb to the top of it. And I'm huffing and panting and my heart's pounding. I'm like, oh, well, my heart rate will come down in a few minutes. HIIT exercise has taught me that. So I pause and breathe and then tromp, tromp, tromp. And, there's that kind of engagement. And in our regular lives, it's just, a lot of self-compassion if this is something you work with. But one of the things that I found so interesting and that I think really factors into thinking about the future is this concept of rumination. And it seems likely that humans in the modern era do a lot more ruminating than our ancestors did, a lot more overthinking things. Now, doesn't mean we didn't have overachiever farmer ruminators who worried about and fretted about, various things, but we end up often employing really functional strategies. How do I wind myself down so I can go to sleep so I'm not worried about things in the night? What are the interventions? Maybe we read a book before bed. Maybe we take a little melatonin. There are various strategies that we have. Meditation, of course, is a really great one. There's a lot of evidence of how helpful that is for interrupting rumination. And then even when you're not meditating, your mind does less rumination, less, obsessing about the past and worrying about what you got wrong and worrying about the future, which is great. And the speculation in the Joy of Movement book was really interesting because she was saying, when you look at people's descriptions of people who love exercise and what it provides for them, the languaging they use sounds really similar to people for whom meditating is just really their jam. They really like it. And she pointed out that when someone's like out walking in the forest, you can't hook them up to the same thing that brain scientists can hook up a meditator. We can scan people's brains while meditating and go, look at all these cool changes that get evoked within the brain that do all these really good things. But you can't do that because they're out tromping in a remote area. They're not holding still and letting you look at the electrical impulses in their brain. So as a result, she's comparing the narrative, the language that gets used, which I think is really, really interesting because it gives you a couple of different ways to go for that, or ways to, double up and have multiple pathways that are really supportive. But her premise was that as people who spend a lot more time outdoors, there's a situational awareness and an engagement and an alertness with your environment where you're alert and available and present and looking around and being aware of beauty and food and opportunities and possible threats. There's just this presence where you're open to possibilities and responding to things, which if you're, a hunter-gatherer is going to go and see what you can round up for dinner or for tools or, all of these different things while monitoring, kind of what's in your environment, unexpected things. The kind of internal screen of the mind that's going round and round isn't happening as much. But living in these really protected, contained houses and environments, we have a lot more opportunity to kind of go down the rabbit hole of our own thinking. And I am a chronic overthinker. There are plenty of times when I think to myself, if I had children, I probably wouldn't be down this rabbit hole of contemplating the ethics of having acquired a salad in a plastic container and the overall impact on my, ecological footprint, and fretting about that. They're just ways that, and not to say that some people don't find really functional ways to deal with packaging while still raising children, and yay for you guys. But the point being that there's just a lot of opportunity for our mind to go down the rabbit hole, and it can turn into a really big leak of our happiness and our well-being, and it can really activate the nervous system. So if we fret about the past or the future, we release low levels of stress chemistry in our bodies, and then we're in this little bit of low-level feedback loop where all kinds of things happen. And low-level stress is really hard on our health over time. It really eats away at it. It takes a lot of important stuff offline, like our immune system and our digestive system. And it massively increases our desire to do, behaviors that aren't very healthy. Like, I would love to go binge eat, something that I know my body doesn't necessarily thrive when I consume too much of the thing. So one of the things that I think is really useful is having a way to self-coach when your mind gets into these kind of loops. And sometimes self-coaching isn't the right intervention. Sometimes if something's really chronic and you're starting to think that, I probably have these neural pathways where I worry over and over again, or I relive this awful junior high moment over and over again. And when something like that's happening, the transmutation breath, I talk about that in my trauma podcast, is a really functional way to deal with it. Or you can proactively do fire ceremony, where you're working to dismantle the energetic structure of that. It's a very good intervention for getting rid of those super highways in your mind where you're like minding your own business and your brain starts, going, well, what if you're alone when you're old? What if, this terrible thing happens or that terrible thing happens? Somebody I know and respect a great deal talked about, like, he recently lost his mother, and for years he'd had the energy leak of worrying about how her lifestyle practices of being a smoker and a drinker and things like that had made him worried about how this was going to impact him when, she came to end of life. And he said, as it turned out, it wasn't particularly impactful on him. She went really quickly when she went, and just a little bit of sadness over the energy leak of fretting about something that just didn't really end up being such a big deal. And the catch-22 of this is the more that we fret and worry about the future, the more we're undermining our resilience. So ideally, I'm a fan of treating resilience like I treat ideally my credit cards when possible, which is to have, as much credit as possible and use as little of it as possible. And so I'm all about curating a life that doesn't diminish our energy, where we're not having to work with things that are really adverse and problematic, and use our resilience to deal with someone who's, borderline emotionally abusive, for example, if we can, avoid it. I know lots of complexity goes into that. Not like anybody wakes up and is like, yay, I totally think I want to, hang out with emotionally abusive people because I could just be stronger in myself. If you have that belief, I have some things to say about that. But I don't think the majority of people listening are like, yes, it is a yoga of the mind to grow in that way. There are usually other factors like economic stability and, this, that, and the other thing. But when we worry and we overanalyze and we overstrategize, and I'm somebody who can totally do this. I just had a really stressful childhood and teenage years, and it wasn't that my environment was bad. It wasn't that my family was abusive. It was that I was deeply introverted, incredibly energetically sensitive, and kind of a weird, wacky soul anyway. I came in really early with, I don't think it's the full story of my soul, but carrying the indigo vibration, and I was early for when, other kids showed up. So there was an experience of my fundamental framework of looking at the world being really different than the people around me, and often, just kind of having some things really, really not compute. And it created a pattern that I really work with to this day, where before I engage with the world in some ways, I tend to over strategize and over predict and overthink about what it could be, which just costs a lot of mental overhead. It's not the end of the world. There are times when, I'm really grateful for it. I went on a cruise to Alaska, and I was hiking alone in a forest. The rain is sprinkling down, and I had exactly the right gear, because before I went to Iceland, I researched all the kinds of gear and, went on this quest to acquire it with, all of these like sails and everything else. And I have really good gear. So type A Katie, who, wanted to figure out how to take care of herself, has gifted future Katie all the way down the line with really functional gear that opened up the ability to be very, very comfortably in slightly adverse weather in just this magical fairy forest kind of experience. It was exquisite. I was able to move through it really well. So I'm not saying that we want to, completely beat up on ourselves about overthinking, but we may want to moderate it a little bit. We may want to give it a little bit of adult supervision. And, there are different ways to do that. You can meditate and you can move your body, and especially being out in nature, awesome ways to do it. But I think that sometimes having a clear adult inner wise person who can counsel you as though you were a small child who's starting to reason out the world and starting to worry about things with an adult that has some really good counsel, the kind of developing our inner sense of really good self-coaching. Somebody said to me recently that she still hears the voice of a therapist that she worked with for many years in her head in some really appropriate functional pieces of wisdom. And so when it comes to the future, I think having kind of a solid understanding of what our brain tells us about the future and how that can differ from reality is a nice kind of foundation to lay. And so you can go back and think about a time when you were really worried about something and everything worked out, or everything worked out even cooler than you could have anticipated, or you had help or assistance that you didn't anticipate. I have had so many people in my life who I didn't even think were like inner circle friends. Like in my mind, inner circle friends really show up. And I've had people that I barely knew who were willing to go way out of their way to do something super kind for me at a moment that I really needed it. And if I had been speculating on how I might deal with a situation, I never would have anticipated having that resource. Sometimes I crowdsource on Facebook because surprisingly, I might get a yes to something that I'd love some help or I'd love a shared experience with. So for this exercise, you're basically giving your mind the essay assignment of finding times when it was mistaken about how hard or awful or complicated or you wouldn't be able to handle it, your story was, and how that was different, because it helps you recognize that what your mind is forward projecting is a possibility, but it may not represent reality. And just kind of that as a baseline of saying, my thinking mind isn't the best predictor of the future. And recognizing that we are resourced and supported in ways that are very much beyond the ability of the thinking mind to work things out. So it doesn't mean we give up, doing the things that we know are functional and taking right action, but it is useful to recognize that the thinking mind tends to think that it's all on its own in the world figuring things out, and it doesn't recognize the dynamic nature of other people. For a lot of people, how can I contribute? I'd like to help. A friend of mine, was saying the other day, thank you for something that I did. I was helping her research something. The thing that just fell out of my mouth is, it always makes me happy when I can contribute to you in some way. And so we can't see other people's creativity and what they have to offer. We can't see how the universe moves on our behalf. We can't see how our soul is working in the background. And ideally, there's this collaboration that happens, but the thinking mind tends to like to run the show and ignore the body wisdom, the soul wisdom, all these other pieces, and, just totally run the show. And we don't want to beat it up for that. It's working really diligently to keep us safe, but we want to recognize that, it's only one piece of the wisdom and ability that we have access to as we move through the world. So when we're thinking about the future and we've got a little stress chemistry in our body or a little anxiety, we will naturally project a future where we have either the same resources or less resources and a worse problem to solve. That's the assumption. There's never an assumption that we could have more or better resources. And this brain of ours that can reason and go through pathways is really a superpower. And it's just a fine line between overthinking and using it really effectively. Like, so much cool stuff comes from this thinking brain. I have a kitty cat who, she's hard to handle, and there are things that have to happen, like her claws being clipped. And, for me, there's, sort of a like, here are all these strategies and here are all these pathways that I could take to accomplishing that, ideally in the way that had the least stress for an elderly cat. And, that's a problem that my brain might noodle on. As an engineer, I like problem solving, so I like mapping things out and figuring things out. There's an enjoyment in that. But we don't want to kind of overdo it and lose track of all the times where something just blindsided us, something really hit the fan, and maybe it had a lot of emotion that we didn't enjoy. Like, I've yet to meet the person who's like, I love those moments when I get really blindsided and my brain just has to kick in and I have to get super resourceful. But you could probably find moments where the rug was pulled out from under you. You got blindsided. Something changed in your environment, and it may not have been pretty or graceful, or it may have moved really fast, and you found a way to figure it out. And so recognizing that, rather than premeditated problem solving, you're actually being in the problem can, be a good time to solve it. And then you actually have all the data. You actually have all the, what's available to me. You might be like, okay, this friend could help me out, but they could be out of town and someone else could be available. There's just so much to be said for how we solve a problem that we're actually there with, instead of an imagined problem that could have a lot of moving parts. For a lot of us, the thought of what is going to be my role in my parents' aging journey, really big question, but there's so many different pathways. There's so many different questions, and future you is really the person to address things when you get there. So I get that a lot of us really like closure. I really like having a plan. I like having a picture. I like knowing what I'm up to. Sitting with lack of closure is stressful. And in the silliest ways imaginable. Like, there's a teeny tiny bit of tension for me, because a trip that I'm taking in April, I put in an Airbnb request to extend our time an extra night that's available on the calendar, and I have to wait for it to be approved before I'm going to book flights. It's November when I'm recording this. The trip is in April. It hasn't even been 12 hours before the person, could have gotten back to me. It's absurd that my mind would be like rechecking my email. Okay, can I go and get to closure? Because there's a peacefulness of like, okay, I've picked the best reservations. I have everything, the car's reserved, all the moving pieces are handled. I really like that feeling. But it's important not to like it so much that we overanalyze and overthink and leak energy. Like, the muscle of sitting with lack of closure, I think, is a really important one. And for a lot of the unknowns, how will my parents' aging process go? How will my aging process go? Is the change in economy that's happening in the world in all these weird ways going to impact me? They're just these things that we can't really know. So the mantra of future me is resourceful and will figure it out. So part of the way I approach the future is to know that I'm investing heavily in my emotional health, my psychological health, and my physical health. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that I'm doing here and now to be really solid in those areas. There's somebody that I go see for facilitated personal inquiry. There's times that I, move my body when that isn't something I'm most inclined to do. I continually buy vegetables and eat at least 50% of the vegetables I bring home before they go bad. It's still working out the system, but it used to be 10%. So on the right track. And when you're feeling really overwhelmed, like sometimes I get people as clients and their brains are just going crazy and kind of bouncing from the problems they don't know how to solve to other problems. So they're, worried about this past trauma and this future thing and this relationship over here. And some of what's good to work with is saying, okay, these are the things that present Katie needs to address. Present Katie needs to solve this problem and that problem and be with this thing and has this on her plate. And I'm investing in future Katie and trusting in future Katie. Like, everything I know about myself is I get healthier over time. So future Katie could be really cool and rocking to deal with things in a way that present Katie can't even imagine. I don't even know what who I'll be in 10 years with all of the journeys and the learnings. There are a lot of people who are at ages that many of us look ahead to and that seem scary, that will report back, I'm happier than I've ever been in my life. Sure, there's some crunchy things about my body, don't love that, but my happiness and peace of mind and my relationships and my well-being are better than they've ever been. And it's great. It's great to listen to that report from, people in a different place on their journey. And so I think it's really worthwhile, if you have one of these, awesome, rocking, intelligent, but overactive kind of minds, to just give it a different assignment, like sorting what life problems are for present you to address and which ones that future you could address. And what can you do to set future you up in a really good place that aligns with what present you needs to solve. So, if you're raising children and hand to mouth with money, the future problem of, retirement might not be something you can make a lot of headway. Compound interest is your friend, so it's great if you can figure out a way, but there just may be things that at this moment you just don't have bandwidth to really work with. And it's great to recognize those. It's great to just know what kinds of important things you haven't yet found bandwidth to address, and to continue to noodle on how can I, get into relationship with, the oil change the car needs, which isn't having to happen this moment, but would be a really, really good idea to take care of sometime in the next, 3 weeks, to give an example. So I feel like this is just a something that I use that really works with my mind as it is. It's not telling my mind to shut up. It's not making it bad and wrong. It's just kind of a wise counseling redirection that says, hey, honey, when you're stressed, we tend to imagine worst possible scenario. We don't imagine serendipity and wonderful outcomes and grace notes in life and really cool things. We imagine all the things that could be hard or difficult or overwhelming. And if you're like me, where you had a period of your life where you felt a lot of overwhelm and exhaustion and trigger, I just wasn't good with emotions, and frankly, puberty hit really hard. I really look back on the biology of the challenges of the shifts that happened in my body at certain ages. We have a lot of acupuncture wisdom that we share with women who are going through menopause, but not as many with, 11, 12, 13-year-olds who are going through puberty. And if I were rewriting my past in the magical way that the teeny tiny town I grew up in had an acupuncturist, which I don't think anyone even knew the word of acupuncture for the most part of the people living there, like that would have been cool. But we can remember times when we felt really overwhelmed and stressed, and our mind will want to strategize how to avoid them by fretting about the future at a time when things might be really good. So we might be losing the really good, or we might be working with some challenges. There might be some really contemporary problems that we need to solve, and our bringing future problems onto our plate at a time when we don't have bandwidth to really be present with them or strategize or take right action can cause the feeling of overwhelm to be much bigger, which can limit our creativity and our resourcefulness, make us not sleep when we need to sleep to deal with what's going on in the world. There, just a lot of challenges to that. So I hope that there's something here that can be really helpful for you. And I like that touchstone, the kind of internal mantra that says, I trust future Katie to handle this thing that's down the road. I trust future Katie in the moment to make really good choices. She makes really good choices, and her choices get better and better and more discerning. And I am living my life now in a way that is designed to help things be really good for future Katie, and that evolves and changes over time. So there are different choices that I'm making with exercise and food. It looks different being 48 than it did, being 27. I was a lot more overwhelmed at 27 with the present moment. And at 48, there's a lot more space to really look at the trajectory of my life. But rather than over analyzing future things, it's about tending to what's on present Katie's plate and trusting future Katie to deal with things as they come up and as they arise. So like I said, I hope there's something that's helpful. And if you have a mind that's similar to mine, I hope that this could be a mantra or a thought or an emotional and mental touchstone that allows you to interrupt over rumination about the future, because that really does dump stress chemistry into our bodies and turn into an energy leak. And what we know from experience is all the fretting about things for the future, it just ends up looking different. There are details of what resources we have and what challenges we have and what constraints we have that we couldn't have anticipated, which means it is the most elegant use of energy to solve the problems that are contemporary. Well, again, with extra bandwidth, wisdom. There's some basic wisdom, like it's great to tend your body in certain ways. So I'm not discounting, investing for retirement if you can, and taking good care of your body with an eye toward the future. But as a general rule, as somebody who, the amount of future rumination I do is more than it should be, and I've learned to make it a lot less than it used to be. I think this could be really relevant. P.S. If you're someone who's really enjoying my podcasts and liking what I have to say, I just want to make you aware that I have a whole academy where I go into topics in incredible detail and have put together kind of the fullness of everything that I think is relevant about a particular topic, whether it's managing energetic sensitivity or right livelihood or soul purpose or using energetics to work with money. There's a lot more depth, even with the long podcasts that I record, that I can go into in that format. And if you're somebody who, consumes the podcast regularly and goes through all of them and would love to hear me talk more, I realize that could be a limited demographic, and, it's okay if that's not. But if you are someone who really feels like you get value out of this, I deliberately kept my courses very, very affordable, and there's a lot of richness to being able to go to the depth of having multiple recordings to explore a topic or an idea. So you can check it out at academy.handsoverheart.com and see if there's something there that you'd like to delve a little deeper into. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.